Hi, I'm David Bloom, Associate Dean at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California. I'm here today with one of Marshall's brightest lights, John Boudreau. John's the Research Director at the Center for Effective Organizations and a Professor of Management and Organization here at USC Marshall. John's latest book is called Beyond HR, The New Science of Human Capital, and we're talking with him today about some of the implications of it, what he's writing about. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
I guess to start out with, you talk in this book about the idea of uh, taking what once was called personnel, now is called HR, and moving it to a new level, to a strategic discipline that you call talentship.
hmm
Well, talk to us about the difference between those two things, between HR and talentship.
Well, it's interesting. The differences actually have a parallel in almost every other profession that has evolved. So, if you think about the world of financial markets, you can think about a kind of compliance element and administrative element to that. We have to follow the rules. We need to make sure the numbers balance. We need to record the numbers. That's kind of bookkeeping. We can also think about in finance the idea of accounting, which has its own disciplinary structure. Again, very essential, provides essential services, things like financial reporting, management accounting, etc. And then on top of those two things, you have this discipline called finance. And the discipline is a lot more about the quality of the decisions that business leaders make about how to compete for and with money. So, net present value, return on investment, economic value added. Those are financial concepts, financial frameworks that help business leaders inside but also outside the finance profession to do a better job of competing for and with money. Well, Pete Ramstad and I, writing the book, were struck by the parallel to the world of talent. We might call it the market for talent in the same sense as money is a resource. And in the talent market, the idea is that we can have compliance issues, often called personnel, follow the rules, etc. Very important. They're never going to go away. Today, we have a lot of emphasis on human resources, which is providing services like training, staffing, etc. And that's also very important and is largely the focus of today's business leaders and today's HR leaders. What we're suggesting is that just like finance, just like marketing, we're going to see an evolution to a decision science that's focused on the decisions we make about competing for and with talent so that it drives our competitive success. And that discipline will start to hold business leaders inside and outside the HR function accountable for how well they make those decisions about this vital resource called talent.
You talk a little bit about a scorecard approach to HR, which is frequently what goes on. They try and figure out um, we spend this number of dollars on personnel, we get this number of dollars out of these people. You're saying that that doesn't make sense in the long run, that there needs to be a strategic approach to think about this stuff. What are companies that are doing that kind of next level approach to dealing with their human capital?
Well, it's a good question. I think one of the first implications, not the only one, but one of the first ones is how do we measure this stuff and how do we account for it and how do we get business leaders to have the data they need to make better decisions? And as you say, because the discipline grew up from an administrative standpoint and because accounting models are very powerful in organizations, what we tend to see right now is actually accounting measures applied to the function of HR. So cost per hire, time to fill, number of HR people to total HR budget, all of those things are what Pete and I call in the book efficiency measures. They'd be akin to measuring marketing by the cost of advertising. But we don't give your chief marketing officer their bonus just because they're the lowest cost advertiser. On the other hand, it's interesting that a lot of business leaders really push HR to be the lowest cost provider of cost per hire, time to train people, time to fill, etc. In marketing, there'd be another question, which would be perhaps something we call effectiveness. So effectiveness in marketing might say, okay, you got low-cost advertising, maybe between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. in the morning on obscure cable stations, and we could say, but what was the effectiveness? So we might say 100% of the people who saw the ad bought the product. In the HR world, effectiveness is things like if we train them, did they learn? If we change the pay system, do people see a connection between pay and performance? So this is where the profession and some companies are largely focused now, really diligently measuring the learning that happens through training, measuring employee engagement, whether engagement changes when we change the performance system or the pay system. And like the effectiveness of advertising, like knowing whether people who see the ad buy the product, that's also very important in HR. But what we're suggesting is that other professions, let's take marketing, have a third question. It's not enough to advertise at a low cost, not even if 100% of the people buy the product, because the next question is going to be, did the right people buy the product? Did the right people see the advertisement? So if you advertise between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. on obscure television cable stations, you tend to be getting people that are between the ages of 60 and 75 years old. If your product's the Xbox or a cell phone, that is not your target market. It's 13 to 25-year-olds. In HR, we seldom ask the question, did the learning happen where it matters most? Did the engagement happen where it matters most? And that's something that business leaders really have to engage in. That's not a question HR answers alone. That's a question that business leaders engage with their HR professionals about to say, where would improvements in the quality of our talent make the biggest difference to our strategic success, in the same way that other professions have evolved to ask which customers make the biggest difference, or which parts of our production process, if improved, would make the biggest difference, that kind of thing.
Okay. You talk a little bit about pivot points within an organization. I think one of the things that's most interesting about what you've written is that the vital talent, the talent you have to invest in and protect and manage and try and figure out strategies to nurture, isn't necessarily the obvious stuff. It's not the CEO, it's not necessarily your top sales guy.
Mm-hmm.
It might be somebody else within the organization. Talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned a story early on about, I believe it's Corning, and how they were trying to deal with production engineers. And talk about how you identify those pivot points, and then how you build a strategy to take care of those folks.
Yeah, I think the idea of this notion of pivot points is something that's fundamental, again, to many disciplines. In operations research, they call it constraints. So if there's a bottleneck in a process like sales or a process like the supply chain or production, you don't work on the machines that aren't at the bottleneck. You improve the machine or you improve the process that is the bottleneck, because everything will work better. So in the book, we talk about differentiating talent, not just in terms of individuals, who's the better performer, who's the high potential, but in terms of the roles they play, in the same way that we might do customer segmentation. So as you say, with Corning, we worked with their HR leaders who began to work with their counterparts in the management area of the business, and they began to discover places where they could say, improving talent here makes the biggest difference to our strategic success. Now, to be sure, leadership and the potential leaders of the future and salespeople are all very important at Corning. But in many organizations, those positions have been have been the subject of attention for so long that the improvements are actually completed. So it doesn't do you as much good maybe to improve a salesperson or improve a leader if everybody's been working on that. At Corning, we found that in terms of creating manufacturing capacity in Central Europe, there was one kind of engineer who knew how to build and run a glass plant that could make those large television screens, and that in the region, there were about 10 of those people. Corning needed 3 of them, given their strategic plan, and we had a very interesting discussion about whether Corning should hire all 10, even though from a budget standpoint they wouldn't have work for the other 7. But if they could hire and keep all 10, every other company that wanted to work in that region would be faced with very expensive options to try and get that engineering capability into their organization, whether with expats or with long-term training programs beginning in engineering schools. So this kind of thinking creates a sort of strategic edge to the world of talent that has existed for a long time in the worlds of customers, money, technology, etc.
Um, you talk in here that we've been looking at the notion of HR for 25 years. I mean, it went from the personnel function to HR for 25 years. We really haven't made a whole lot of progress to this next level that you talk about in all that time, and that there's a lot of work to be done. We're here at Premier Business School. What should we be doing in teaching our executives in training here to better use and value the people, the human capital that is a crucial part of their future business operations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as a professor here and having joined the Marshall School about 4 years ago, for the first time teaching MBAs about human resource management, that's one of the things that was the impetus for the book, was the beginning of thinking about how is the message different for business leaders outside the HR profession than it would be for people who aspire to be HR leaders of the future. And you're absolutely right. I think one of the big messages of the book is that professions that have matured to be powerful strategic frameworks like finance and marketing, and more recently the world of information, where we have chief information officers, those professions became vital and strategically important, not so much when the people in the function develop these frameworks, but when business leaders outside the function are held accountable for the sophistication of their thinking. For example, every business leader knows that they have to understand what net present value and return on investment are. That's not just true for finance people. That's true
Hmm.
for everybody.
Hmm.
Every business leader has to know how to calculate and how to manage operating cash flow. That's not just true for finance people. That's true of anybody with a marketing background, anybody with an HR background. And so customer segments would be the same thing, product lifecycle would be the same thing. And so I'm struck often by the depth of thinking that business leaders can do in those areas, marketing, finance, technology, and the rather superficial, to be honest with you, thinking that even good business leaders have about human behavior at work. To be honest, their thinking about talent is far, far less deep and logical than their ability to think about other resources like cash and customers and things like that.
So it sounds like you're saying that there's an opportunity here for a savvy business person, a savvy company, to really focus on this area and get a competitive advantage.
I think that's exactly right. We talk in the book about hidden strategic opportunities that no one sees. I like to use the term with the MBA students about arbitrage. So if you are a Disney theme park, for example, and you realize that while the characters in your park are fundamentally vital and important, a difference in performance on someone who is in the park sweeping the streets and helps a guest. One of my favorite letters to Disney was one where a guest wrote in and said, "Thank you so much for having a diverse staff in your hotel. There was a speech disabled housekeeper. She came to our room every day to clean. My children had a very fun relationship with her. She was wonderfully personal." And they basically said, our kids learn more about diversity and about differentially abled people from those 2 days interacting with your housekeeper than they ever could have learned by us telling them about it. Now, Disney loves those letters. Imagine that you're Disney and you're the first one to realize that great housekeepers make a big difference to your success. Or when sweepers stop sweeping on the streets of Anaheim and help you find a shady spot up the hill or help you find the store that you want. If everybody else is hiring sweepers like custodians, if everybody else is hiring housekeepers just for cleaning rooms, and you figure this out, you as a business leader have a chance to compete in that market like nobody else does. It's very much like the first people who started applying portfolio theory to bond trading around the turn of the century. They completely changed the game, and for a while, they had enormous arbitrage opportunities.
Interesting. Uh, Real quickly, you co-wrote this book with Peter Ramstad. Tell us real quickly about Peter and what his background is.
Sure, Peter's been a longtime partner for about 15 years. Peter's background is accounting. Peter was a CFO. He was a partner in an accounting consulting firm, and then became, during the time I worked with him, an executive vice president at a management competency and management resource consulting firm, Personnel Decisions International. One of my favorite stories about Pete is that the reason we were attracted to each other, of course, was because he was coming from the accounting side saying, why can't we get a better handle on the value of these intangibles that lie in talent? I was coming from the talent side and saying, why can't we get better numbers around this important resource? Pete actually studied accounting history at the graduate level, rare discipline to be sure, but it's one of the reasons that we began to think about the evolution of the HR profession in the context of the evolution of professions like accounting. It's how you uncover the idea that before the turn of the century, today's modern accounting processes and modern finance processes were largely non-existent.
Mm.
And you realize that companies changed the game around the turn of the century, competing with money, and they may be able to change the game now by competing with talent.
The book is Beyond HR, The New Science of Human Capital by John Boudreau and Peter Ramstad on Harvard Business School Press. Thank you very much.